If you clicked on this video, chances are there's something you're struggling to change. Maybe it's a routine you can't seem to stick to, a bad habit you're trying to break, or even a full-blown addiction you're desperate to overcome. But no matter how badly you want to change, you just can't seem to break free from the cycle. The cycle of starting fresh, convincing yourself that this time will be different, only to find yourself falling back into the same old patterns again and again. And the more this cycle repeats, the more defeated and hopeless you start to feel. This struggle is so common, it's practically a fundamental part of the human experience. And no one knows this cycle better than I do. For me, the problem was food. I struggled with binge eating and other food and weight-related issues for several years. And no matter what I tried, I just couldn't seem to break free from it. And trust me when I say, I truly tried everything. Countless diets and lifestyle strategies, even therapy and coaching. But none of the traditional approaches ever helped me, at least not for long. And after so many failed attempts, I started to wonder if change was even possible for me. But despite how hopeless I felt, I never fully gave up on myself. Because deep down, I knew I was capable of more. And as it turns out, I was right. But it wasn't until I started studying psychology that things finally started to shift for me. The first part of that shift was realizing that the way people talk about self-control is completely wrong. Many people seem to believe that self-control is either something you have or you don't. But that's just not true. Self-control is a skill, not a personality trait. And it's a skill anyone can learn with the right mindset and strategies in place. That being said, my psychology degree could only take me so far, because the deeper I went, the more I realized that accurate and practical information on self-control and behavior change was almost impossible to find, even in the most evidence-based spaces. Sure, some of the advice was helpful, but none of it ever captured the full picture, and I was always left with more questions than answers. What I truly wanted and needed was a clear, practical guide to actually changing my behavior. And after realizing that no one else would be able to provide that for me, I knew it was something I'd have to figure out on my own. So that's exactly what I set out to do. Of course, it was far from easy. As you may have heard me say in previous videos, my struggle with binge eating was, by far, the hardest thing I've ever had to overcome. But eventually, after years of research and self-experimentation, I was finally able to piece together why I was struggling, and most importantly, how to get myself to stop. Which leads me to where I am today. I've been completely binge-free for over 5 years now, and I've maintained my ideal weight ever since. But more importantly, I finally feel free from the addiction that sabotaged my health and happiness for so many years. And while I often wish I didn't have to struggle as much as I did, that process taught me so much. Not just about food and weight loss, but about behavior change in general. It allowed me to create the system I'd been searching for all along. A clear, complete, practical guide to overcoming any problematic behavior. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking that system down step by step. This video is actually a continuation of my last video, where I talked more specifically about binge eating and why we struggle with it in the first place. And as I mentioned in that video, it's crucial to understand why you engage in a problematic behavior before you can change it. So I definitely recommend watching that if you haven't already, especially if food is the thing you struggle with. But to quickly summarize the key takeaways of that video, binge eating is more of a behavioral problem rather than an emotional one, unlike what your therapist might tell you. And just like every other behavioral problem, the true cause, at the most fundamental level, is choosing to give into urges to engage in that behavior. Essentially, urges to binge are uncomfortable, and choosing to binge is what relieves that discomfort, even if it's just for a short period of time. And this leaves us with two possible solutions. Either eliminate urges or stop acting on them. Naturally, most solutions focus on eliminating urges because it seems like the easier way out. But as I explained at length in my last video, this simply isn't practical or even possible in most cases. So this only leaves us with one option, and that's to stop acting on urges. And this doesn't just apply to binge eating. It's the same for any other habit you want to break. All habits are driven by urges, and the key to overcoming them for good is learning how to stop acting on those urges, which is exactly what this step-by-step guide is designed to help you do. So although this is the system I use to overcome binge eating, keep in mind that it can be applied to pretty much any problematic habit you want to overcome. A universal roadmap of behavior change. Now, obviously, I can't fully cover every single behavior change strategy in one video. But when I say this is a complete roadmap, what I mean is that I'm going to give you a very clear overview of what behavior change actually requires, and the fundamental steps involved in that process. So even if you don't understand absolutely everything in detail, you'll have a much better understanding of how behavior change works in general, what really matters, where different tools and strategies fit in, and the exact steps you need to follow to create lasting change. So the first key thing to understand about any behavior change goal is that we're usually not trying to change behavior for the sake of it. We want to change behavior because it's necessary to get to somewhere else we want to be. Once again, take binge eating. The behavior in itself is actually extremely enjoyable and rewarding, hence why we're struggling to stop in the first place. What we really want to avoid are the consequences of that behavior. Maybe that's weight gain, negative health outcomes, or the feelings of shame and guilt around it. So while stopping the behavior may be the main behavior change goal, it's really just a means to a more important end. To illustrate this process as clearly as possible, I'm going to use a very simple analogy that I'll be referring back to throughout this video. I want you to think of behavior change like you're a knight on a journey. The destination is your ultimate goal, the reason you want to change, and the path to get there are the actions required to achieve that goal, the actual behavior you're trying to change. Now, it goes without saying, achieving any goal will always take some degree of time and effort. Sure, every goal is a little different, and some paths will be easier than others, but there's simply no immediate shortcut to get from one destination to another. That being said, what makes this journey especially difficult isn't actually the path itself, but rather, it's what you encounter along the way. And what you encounter are urges. You can think of urges like enemies trying to knock you off track or push you back to where you started. So, successfully reaching any goal requires two main things. One, having a solid plan to get there, one that's actually doable. And two, being able to overcome the enemies trying to stop you along the way. And this second part is what most people actually struggle with, because most people usually do know what to do. The problem is that they just don't know how to stick to it. They don't know how to overcome the enemies attacking them along the path. Remember what I said earlier about eliminating urges versus not acting on them. Trying to eliminate urges would be like trying to find a way to make these enemies disappear. Maybe by taking a path with less of them, or trying to find your way around them. And of course, that sounds super smart in theory, but in practice, it's just not possible. You may be able to find a path that's easier, but no path will eliminate struggle entirely. Or, at the very least, it's not something you can fully control or rely on. For example, there are multiple ways to achieve a weight loss goal, and definitely ways that involve a lot less hunger and cravings than others. But regardless of what path or plan you choose, experiencing those feelings, to some extent, is basically inevitable. And if the only way you know how to deal with them is by avoiding them entirely, then it's highly unlikely you'll succeed. So, the key is learning how to defend yourself from the attackers along the path. In other words, learning how to stay on track despite your urges to do otherwise. Now, when I say defend yourself from attackers, a lot of people probably picture fighting them off, fighting your urges, as if it's this test of willpower. And that probably doesn't feel very reassuring, because, as we all know, willpower feels extremely effortful, and chances are, it's failed you more times than it hasn't. In fact, research suggests that self-control is a limited resource. So, if that's true, if self-control eventually runs out, how could it possibly be the way to permanently and reliably change behavior? Well, what I want to argue in this video is that most people are simply thinking about self-control in the wrong way. And what most people think of as willpower, this draining, limited resource you can't rely on, is very different from the kind of self-control strategies I'm going to talk about in this video. And what this ultimately comes down to is the difference between struggle and discomfort. The kind of self-control strategies I'm going to talk about may still involve some discomfort, but it doesn't need to feel like a constant struggle in the way that willpower does. To understand this more clearly, I want you to think about the difference between how it feels to stick to a really difficult diet and how it feels getting yourself to work every morning. Sure, getting yourself to work can definitely be hard, but usually not in a way that feels like it requires willpower. At least not for most people, most of the time. What I mean by that is, even though you may not love being there, it's usually not an intense mental battle to get yourself there. You might not feel like waking up when your alarm goes off, but usually you just get up anyway. You don't debate with yourself or spiral over it, because you know it's just something you have to do. Now, compare that to how most people feel about sticking to a diet, especially if you struggle with things like overeating or binge eating. For most people, sticking to a diet often does feel like an intense mental battle. You're constantly fighting with your cravings, negotiating with yourself, and you simply don't trust yourself to actually follow through. You feel uncertain, frustrated, and out of control. So while work may be physically uncomfortable, it rarely feels like this kind of psychological struggle. And that's exactly the difference between relying on willpower and successfully implementing the system I'm going to outline in this video. The journey itself may still require some time and energy, but you shouldn't feel like you're constantly fighting with yourself. And at the end of the day, I think that's what most of us want anyway. The ability to stick to what you say you're going to do, regardless of how uncomfortable it feels in the moment. Being able to fully control and trust ourselves. So, what's really going on here? What makes behavior change feel like such a struggle mentally? Well, let's briefly review what I discussed in my last video. What urges actually are, and why they're so difficult to dismiss in the first place. Urges come from a very primitive brain area, which I simply call the lower brain. And although the lower brain is designed for survival, it's ultimately a very flawed system. It knows what gives us pleasure in the moment, but it doesn't have the ability to consider long-term consequences of behavior. Because of this, human beings evolved a much more advanced brain area, which I call the higher brain. The higher brain is what allows us to think rationally about the past and future, and recognize that what feels good right now might not be best for us long term. And this is a super important distinction, because it's the presence of these two distinct brain areas that explains why we have conflicting desires. The lower brain produces urges to binge, and the higher brain produces a desire to stop. Thankfully though, the higher brain doesn't just give us the desire to stop, it also gives us the ability to. While the lower brain can generate intense, uncomfortable urges, it's ultimately the higher brain that decides whether or not we act on them. That being said, it's obviously much easier said than done. And what makes it so difficult is how influential and deceptive the lower brain can be. The lower brain makes resisting urges difficult in two main ways. One, uncomfortable feelings, and two, irrational thoughts, also known as cognitive distortions. It's obvious how uncomfortable feelings can push us toward a behavior, but it's not like we're incapable of tolerating them. The real problem is how the lower brain influences your thinking and convinces you to act on those feelings. The lower brain generates thoughts that feel completely logical in the moment, but they're actually just automatic, irrational justifications based on past reinforced behavior. Things like, one more bite won't hurt, I'll start fresh tomorrow, or I've already messed up, so might as well keep going. What makes these thoughts so powerful is that they often feel and sound like they're coming from your higher self. But it's only after you give in that you realize they weren't. And this explains why willpower often feels like such a mental struggle and is often considered a limited resource. Most people simply fail to recognize that these thoughts actually aren't coming from their higher selves. So rather than just dismissing them, they start this mental tug of war with them, which is something you can only do for so long. Just like physically fighting off attackers. You may be able to fight them off for a while, but you're almost destined to fail eventually. Especially because, in this case, the attackers are just as strong as you. Your lower brain talks to you the exact same way you talk to it, through your thoughts. Hence, the true solution and the outcome of this system is not fighting with these thoughts in the first place. You'll still have to implement a few key skills in the moment, but the success of the system has a lot more to do with what you do in advance. It's a set of beliefs and pre-decision making that will allow you to avoid the mental struggle entirely, or at least experience much less of it. The way I like to think of this, in terms of our little analogy, is like the difference between using a sword versus using a shield. If willpower is like using a sword, this system is like holding up a shield. It might take a bit of effort to hold it up, but it's nothing compared to the skill and energy required to constantly be fighting off attackers. And if your shield is strong enough, it genuinely won't feel like effort at all. So, now that we fully understand the problem, let's break down the solution, step by step. I like to call the system the 7 C's of behavior change, because there are 7 key steps, and they all happen to start with the letter C. But these 7 steps can actually be divided into 2 main phases. The first phase is what you need to do before you experience an urge. This is the equivalent of prepping your shield. And the second is what you need to do in the moment, when the urge actually shows up. This is the equivalent to holding up your shield. The key thing to understand is that what you do beforehand is the true foundation of behavior change. And the stronger that foundation is, aka the stronger your shield, the easier it will be when the urge pops up, and the less you'll need to rely on a sword. So, let's start by talking about what a super strong foundation looks like. The first step is cause, meaning you need to have a strong enough reason to change in the first place. In simple terms, to stop a behavior, you have to genuinely want to stop. This might seem super obvious at first, but cultivating a deep sense of motivation is always the first step to any significant change. However, it's not just about having the desire to change. Your desire to change needs to be stronger than your desire to stay the same. You can refer to this as decisional balance. Every behavior has both pros and cons. Even so-called bad behaviors, like binge eating. If it didn't, you wouldn't be doing it in the first place. It's extremely pleasurable and provides an instant relief from negative emotion in the moment. But just like every behavior has benefits, it also has consequences. And if you actually want to change, you need to determine that the benefits of stopping outweigh the consequences overall. But here's the problem. Most people already know this. In fact, many people are desperate for change. So why do people still struggle? Once again, it comes back to how the lower brain manipulates your thinking in the moment. The lower brain only cares about what feels good right now. It doesn't have the ability to consider long-term consequences of behavior like your higher brain does. So, when you're experiencing intense urges to go off plan, the long-term benefits of change can easily be forgotten. This is why relying on motivation in the way most people think about it doesn't work. Most people assume motivation means feeling like sticking to your plan in the moment. But when you're experiencing an urge, that's just not going to happen. Your lower brain will be generating powerful thoughts to make going off plan seem like something you want to do, or are at least okay with. It's essentially false wanting. It feels like a real desire, but it's not actually coming from your higher brain, which, in this context, is the part of you that actually matters. Your higher brain is where your true sense of self lies, and is the only part of you that considers both short-term and long-term consequences of behavior. In other words, it's the only part of you that can determine what you actually want and care about overall. So, once you decide that the pros of stopping outweigh the cons overall, you need to trust that any thought or feeling that suggests otherwise is simply false wanting coming from your lower brain. And it's not just about realizing that change is best overall. You need to be able to remember that when it doesn't feel that way in the moment. And this is where articulating your why comes in. Your why is something you might hear a lot of people talking about, but it simply refers to the deeper motivations behind your desire to change. It's what truly matters to you, and is highly tied to your personal values and long-term goals. Having a clearly defined why is essential because it serves as an anchor during challenging moments. When you're experiencing temptation or doubt, it's your why that reconnects you to what you're working toward and why it's worth it. It ties back to what we talked about with having a strong shield. When you're not clear on what you actually want, you'll end up debating with the lower brain. But when your why is really strong, you don't even entertain the lower brain's arguments. I'll refer back to an analogy I mentioned in my last video. Imagine someone offered you $1 billion to stop binge eating for a certain period of time, or that a loved one's life depended on you not binge eating. You wouldn't sit there wondering, can I really control this? Is this really worth it? You wouldn't even consider binge eating as an option because you know it's worth it, and there would be very little willpower needed. This is the perfect example of how a strong shield eliminates the need for a sword. The clearer and more powerful your why is, the easier it becomes to recognize and dismiss false wanting generated by the lower brain. The next key step is clarity. You need to define the exact behavior you want to change and the exact plan you'll use to achieve it. Once again, this might seem obvious, but being crystal clear about what it is you want is absolutely essential. And this is because the lower brain thrives on ambiguity. Not only does the lower brain influence your thoughts and feelings, but it does so in the sound of your own rational voice. And this is what makes it so deceptive. When an urge hits, you won't hear an internal voice saying, give up on your goals. You'll hear thoughts that sound just like any other thoughts. Thoughts that sound logical. Things like, one more bite won't hurt. Or, it's okay if I eat a bit extra today. I'll make up for it tomorrow. This is what makes urges so convincing. The lower brain doesn't just create physical cravings. It creates mental justifications. And if you're not clear on your plan, it's easy to get tricked into thinking these thoughts are rational. This is why having a clear and objective plan is essential. If you define exactly what behavior change looks like to you, then any thought or feeling that suggests deviating from that plan can immediately be recognized as the lower brain. And once you do that, identifying the lower brain becomes automatic. In short, in order to successfully dismiss urges, you need to be able to recognize urges to begin with. You need to be able to distinguish between lower brain thoughts and your own rational thoughts. And the way you do that is by getting extremely clear on your plan. But of course, not just any plan will do. And this actually ties back to the last point about your desire to change. The desire to change can't just apply to the end goal. It has to apply to the plan itself. In other words, the pros of sticking to the plan need to outweigh the cons, not just the benefits of the end result. And this is exactly why unsustainable plans can never work. The end goal may feel worth it to you, but if what it actually takes to get there feels unbearable when push comes to shove, you simply won't stick to it. So this is one of the trickiest steps for people to get right. It's something I dive much deeper into with clients, but for now, here's a simple framework that outlines the key qualities a plan needs to be effective. It's a very common and well-known goal-setting framework, but I actually think it's pretty accurate and useful. And that's the acronym SMART. SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. Most people talk about this in the context of SMART goals, but the real key is SMART planning. Not only does the end goal need to meet all these criteria, but the plan itself does too. If your actual process isn't clear and sustainable, it doesn't matter how smart the goal is. You simply won't follow through. But before moving on to the next point, I want to quickly talk about how food differs from other problematic behaviors, especially for those of you watching this with binge eating in mind. This is the step where food becomes very different from things like substance addiction. Because unlike substance addiction, where the plan can be complete abstinence, we simply need food to live. So you can't just stop eating or define every desire for food as the lower brain. And this makes recognizing the lower brain a lot more difficult. On top of that, there's no single objective definition of binge eating. What counts as too much varies from person to person. And this subjectivity can make it easy to doubt yourself or talk yourself out of recognizing a binge for what it is. And while I do believe that gaining crystal clear clarity on what binge eating means to you is the solution to this problem, this can also make things very tricky, because if clarity is applied in the wrong way, it can actually backfire. For example, if you define binge eating too rigidly, maybe as a specific calorie target, especially one that's much lower than what a true binge actually is, this can lead to all or nothing behavior around food. Essentially, if you start viewing normal eating or even slight overeating as a binge, then any small slip-up can trigger the screw it mentality. So instead of just moving on or getting back on track quickly, you feel like you've already failed. And that feeling of failure can turn a minor slip-up into a full-on binge. This is actually something I struggled with for a long time. I didn't know how to reconcile the fact that being rigid and objective can make it easier for me to recognize the lower brain, but can also cause all or nothing behavior. Thankfully, I've been able to think about this extensively over the years, and I did end up figuring out a solution. One might say another system that enabled me to overcome my all or nothing food behaviors for good. Since that would take a while to explain and isn't relevant for every type of behavior change goal, I'm going to save that for a future video. So you're going to have to wait a little bit for that. But for now, just know that even with binge eating, clarity is still key. It may just take a little more time and effort to figure out. The next step is confidence. In essence, you have to believe in your ability to change. Confidence is one of the most overlooked but necessary parts of change. Because no matter how strong your plan is, and no matter how much you want to change, if you don't truly believe you can, you simply won't follow through. Like I always say, if you don't truly believe you can change, why would you even try? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is why adopting a growth mindset is so important. Because when urges hit and things feel hard, it's the confidence in yourself and your ability to follow through that determines whether you keep going or give up. But here's the big problem. Confidence is extremely hard to cultivate when you've been struggling for so long. When you struggled with binge eating or another bad habit for years, when you've made promises to yourself and broken them over and over again, it's really hard to believe that this time will be any different. So, how can you build confidence if you don't have any yet? There are actually two main ways. The first is education, understanding how your brain works. Put simply, most people feel out of control because they don't fully understand the neuroscience of behavior change. They assume urges mean something deeper, or that they're impossible to resist. But when you understand that urges are just automatic signals from the lower brain, and that your higher brain is always the one in control, you can stop feeling so powerless. And that alone can lay the foundation for confidence. This is exactly what I discussed in my last video, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. The second way is evidence. Seeing proof that change is possible. Once again, this is where it gets tricky, because if you've been stuck for a long time, you simply don't have that proof from yourself yet. But there are two ways to work around this. The first is to gather evidence in other ways. This could mean reflecting on past wins of your own, or looking at other people who've made the change you want to make. Unless they had some major advantage you don't, there's no reason to believe you can't change too. And if you feel like you have no one to relate to, you can use examples like mine. Trust me when I say, my struggles with binge eating were as bad as they get. So if I was able to change, I truly believe anyone can. The second way, and probably the most important, is understanding that it's actually okay not to feel completely confident in the beginning. Because being confident in your ability to change is not the same as feeling confident. Confidence isn't something you can just decide to feel. That feeling of confidence, of being able to fully trust yourself, is something you have to earn over time. And there's simply no way around that. The key is being prepared for those feelings of self-doubt in the beginning, remembering that self-doubt is just another product of the lower brain and doesn't reflect the truth about you or your abilities. Plus, the more you show up and prove your trustworthiness to yourself, the more your confidence will grow. This is one of the biggest reasons behavior change gets easier over time. And just keeping this in mind, that your confidence will grow, can often be enough to help you push through those initial periods of self-doubt. So, even though confidence is a key step, it's not something you necessarily need to feel right away. The real key is believing in your ability to change and taking action regardless of how you feel. The next step is commitment. Once you're clear on the exact behavior you want to change, you actually have to decide and commit to changing it. A lot of you have probably experienced what a lack of commitment looks like. You know you want to change, you might even have a solid plan, but the change keeps getting pushed back. You keep telling yourself you'll do it, and maybe you try a few times, but you never fully follow through. And this is a really hard place to be, because the belief that you'll change eventually almost becomes an excuse not to care about it as much right now. In reality, this is just another way your lower brain keeps you stuck. It tells you, I'll start tomorrow, or I'll start on Monday. But when that day comes, it's no easier than it was the day before, and the cycle keeps repeating itself. The real problem here is that you haven't fully committed to change. So, what actually makes a true commitment? The way I look at it, there are three crucial aspects that turn a decision to change into a real powerful commitment to change. The first is absoluteness. A true commitment is absolute and non-negotiable, meaning you don't leave room for mistakes or exceptions. If your goal is to stop binge eating, for example, that means being 100% committed to never binge eating. Not sometimes, not only when it's convenient, but never. Now, you might hear people say, well, you can't be perfect, or it's okay to make mistakes, but I actually disagree with this. This is something I'll talk about more in a future video, but in short, it's just too much of a generalization. Perfection depends on how you define it. For example, if my goal is to never cheat on my partner, does it make sense to say, well, you can't expect perfection? Of course not, because in some areas, perfection is the only acceptable standard. It all comes down to what you're committing to. If your goal is unrealistic, then obviously expecting perfection isn't fair. But this goes back to smart planning. If your plan is set up properly, you shouldn't need to make mistakes at all. Once you create a plan that you can 100% commit to, everything becomes so much easier. Once again, it comes back to the lower brain. A lot of the discomfort you experience during an urge comes from going back and forth mentally between resisting and giving in. That mental tug of war is what makes it feel so exhausting. But when you're fully committed, engaging in that behavior isn't even an option in your mind. And once you remove it as an option and tell yourself no choice, the lower brain loses its power entirely. And although it's counterintuitive, this is why 100% commitment is often easier than 90%, because it removes decision fatigue and the constant internal debate. The second component is immediacy. The moment you commit is the moment you decide to change now, not later. Many people wait for the perfect time to change, thinking it will be easier once they have everything all figured out. But the perfect time is an illusion. The truth is, conditions will never be perfect. You can always find a reason to delay. And this is just another way the lower brain keeps you stuck. It tells you, just one last time, or I can start tomorrow. But when tomorrow comes, it's no easier than it was the day before. In fact, it's just another now. And to make matters worse, every time you delay, you reinforce the habit of delaying, making behavior change even harder down the line. This is why the best time to change is almost always now. Even if your plan isn't perfect, getting started with something is always better than nothing. And you can always refine your commitment along the way, without needing to procrastinate or figure absolutely everything out first. But again, what this ultimately comes down to is a mindset. Once you decide there is no later, you remove the option to delay. And when delaying is no longer an option, once again, the lower brain loses its power over you, and following through becomes effortless. The last component of a strong commitment is permanence. This means removing the option of changing your mind in the future. Because just like leaving the door open to delay a decision makes it harder to follow through, leaving the door open for future exceptions also keeps you stuck. When you tell yourself, I'll just see how it goes, or I can always change my mind later, you're already planning for the possibility of failure. And that uncertainty creates mental friction every time an urge arises. But when you decide that this is final, that there is no going back, you remove the constant debate in your mind. And once the option to quit is gone, following through becomes automatic. As you can see, all of these components are kind of related. Of course, not every behavior change goal can or should meet all of these standards all of the time. Some goals aren't as straightforward as others, and certain circumstances might require some more flexibility. But the key thing is knowing that the closer you can get to these standards, the easier it will be for you to follow through. That's why, if a change is truly important to you, especially if it's a very destructive habit that you've been struggling with for a long time, or if it's something that's unnecessary, like binge eating, something that's never necessary, the more you'll benefit from this level of commitment. The more absolute, immediate, and permanent your decision is, the less room there is for doubt, hesitation, and negotiation. And that's what makes real, lasting change so much easier to achieve. And that sums up the foundation: cause, clarity, confidence, and commitment. Each of these components could go a lot deeper, but what matters most is understanding why the foundation is so important to begin with. And it's because of how much easier it makes it to dismiss urges in the moment. Remember, the lower brain's weapons are cognitive distortions. Most people try to fight back by arguing in the moment, but that's exhausting because those distortions can sound just as convincing as your own rational voice. So instead, the best approach is to shield yourself from those cognitive distortions before they even arise. And that's exactly what this foundation does. For example, a strong why stops you from believing that your true self wants to overeat. Clarity removes ambiguity, so the lower brain can immediately be recognized. Confidence disputes the idea that you're not in control. And commitment eliminates the option of delaying or making excuses. And the stronger each of these steps are, the less effort it takes to dismiss urges. AKA, the bigger your shield, the less you need to rely on a sword. But even if you develop a super strong shield, it still takes a bit of effort to hold it up. Which brings us to the second phase of this system: what you need to do in the moment of an urge. The first and main step in this phase is control, which simply refers to actually controlling your behavior in the moment. And it has its own step-by-step system. As I stated, the key difference between willpower and this system comes down to fighting your thoughts versus being able to dismiss them. Instead of getting caught up in thinking, you recognize that those thoughts aren't truly you and don't engage with them at all. When you apply this correctly, you may still experience some discomfort, but it won't feel like a mental struggle in the same way that willpower does. So let's break down exactly what that process looks like. The first step is to recognize your lower brain. Like we talked about, this only works if you're clear on what the lower brain actually is, which is why having clarity is so key. Once you have clarity around your plan, the process becomes very simple. You simply recognize any thought or feeling that urges you to go off plan as your lower brain. Once you recognize the lower brain, the next step is to reaffirm your beliefs. And this requires a solid belief system to begin with, one that reminds you of the true nature of the lower brain, that it's just a misguided, automatic part of your mind, and is not something you need to entertain or engage with at all. It's not truly you, and does not reflect your true needs or desires. Again, this ties directly back to the foundation. If your foundation is strong, you should already know this. But especially in the beginning, since those beliefs aren't fully solidified yet, you may need to intentionally remind yourself in the moment. The key is to remember that the lower brain is very quick thinking, so these affirmations can't be overly complicated. Again, this isn't about talking yourself out of something. You simply need to bring to mind what you already know. And to make it even easier for you, here are 5 key affirmations you can write down and rehearse. Number 1, this urge is not truly me. Number 2, this urge is an illusion. Number 3, this urge has no power unless I engage with it. Number 4, I am in complete control of my voluntary behavior. And number 5, I will not entertain or act on this urge, no matter what. The next step is detaching from the urge. And this is the most tangible skill in this entire system. Once again, the mistake most people make is trying to fight the urge, whether by arguing with it, analyzing it, or trying to make it go away. But the lower brain is just too primitive to respond to reason. So any attempt to control or suppress it tends to backfire, and often just makes it even stronger. The solution to this is detachment. Detachment can be tricky to grasp at first, but to put it simply, it means mentally separating your conscious self from the lower brain. Exactly what I've been alluding to this whole time. Some very popular binge eating resources talk about this extensively, but I've always found them a bit elusive and hard to apply in a practical way. So let's break down what detachment actually is and feels like. At its core, detachment is a shift in attention, but it's less about what you shift your attention to and more about how you're attending to something. Instead of getting caught up in your thoughts, you take a mental step back and observe them from a distance. This requires a metacognitive shift, meaning you're not just changing your thoughts, but thinking about your thoughts in a particular way. It's like the difference between watching cars go by on the side of the road versus actually being in one. The cars on the road are the same, but the way you experience them is completely different. You might have heard this analogy used to explain mindfulness meditation, and it's very similar to that. Just like in mindfulness, where the goal isn't to rid your mind of thoughts entirely, the goal of detachment isn't to make urges disappear. Instead, you simply acknowledge them without judgment. You allow urges to be there, but you don't engage with them or assign them any meaning. Another helpful analogy would be like hearing a conversation in a foreign language versus your own. You still hear the same sounds, but you don't attach any meaning to them. Another one would be like being in a public space and hearing a baby cry that isn't your own. You definitely notice it, and it might be a bit annoying, but it's not your responsibility to do anything about it. So you just accept it and move on. And this ties directly into the next step, acceptance. Because just like a crying baby is still a bit annoying, detaching from an urge doesn't mean that all discomfort will disappear. And once again, this brings us back to the difference between discomfort and struggle. Even after choosing to dismiss the lower brain, you might still experience some unavoidable physical discomfort, like hunger and fatigue. And while you can definitely try to minimize it with things like replacement behaviors and other coping strategies, often there's only so much you can do. So although it can be helpful, the key isn't even necessarily minimizing discomfort. It's learning to accept and tolerate it. This may sound like it makes the process harder, but in reality, it actually makes things easier. Because, once again, the majority of discomfort you experience during an urge isn't actually physical. It's more of a mental conflict you create by engaging with it. Fighting it, resisting it, being scared of it, getting annoyed by it, trying to make it go away. That's what makes it feel unbearable. But by detaching from the mental component of the urge and accepting the physical discomfort for what it is, you stop trying to solve an unsolvable conflict and usually realize that what's left is actually very tolerable. Let's go back to our night analogy. You can think of the discomfort you experience during an urge like the discomfort involved in taking a long walk to your destination. Sure, it might take some time and energy, but it's nothing compared to the debilitating fear and exhaustion of constantly fighting off attackers along the way. And that's basically all it takes to dismiss urges in the moment. But of course, this isn't something you do just once, which leads me to the next key step, consistency, which at its core just means doing the same thing over and over again. Because even if you successfully detach from an urge when it first appears, uncomfortable thoughts and feelings might linger for a while. So staying detached does require a certain degree of focus and attention. But again, it's nowhere near as difficult as willpower feels. And the best part? The more consistent you are with this, the easier it will get. And there are two main reasons for this. First, because your brain will stop producing urges once it learns that they no longer lead to any sort of reward. This is simply how neuroplasticity and habit formation work. It's just like the attackers realizing that you're stronger than them. They won't even bother trying to fight you in the first place. And second, because your belief systems, habits, and identity start to solidify over time. And this part is huge, because your identity is probably the strongest predictor of behavior. If you start seeing yourself as a certain type of person, someone who no longer acts on urges, your brain naturally wants to act in line with that. And over time, it just becomes automatic and effortless. So, if willpower is a sword, and the strategies I talked about in this video are your shield, then identity is your armor. And once you have armor, you don't even need to put in the effort of holding up a shield anymore, because now it's just a part of who you are. The final step in this system is correction, which simply means learning and adjusting as you go. As you progress, you may need to refine your goals, tweak your plan, or get back on track after unforeseen circumstances. So, continuous reflection and adjustment is crucial for long-term success. But this is more of a supporting step, and is simply too much to cover right now. So I'll save the details for a future video, along with a few bonus steps, and how they impact behavior change. So if you're interested in that, just stay tuned. And that sums up my system. This is essentially every key step involved in successfully overcoming any problematic behavior. Like I said, this is the framework that completely changed my life. Or I should say, is the framework I developed throughout the process of changing my life. And no matter what change you want to make, these steps need to be addressed in some way, which is what makes this a truly universal system for behavior change. Of course, you still have to go on the journey, but at least now you have a solid roadmap. That being said, just knowing the steps isn't always enough. What actually makes a difference is how you apply them. For example, how do you make sure your why is strong enough to override your desire for instant gratification? How do you address deeply ingrained cognitive distortions? How do you know if you're choosing the right plan for you? And how do you navigate the need to adjust your plan over time? These details really do matter. And while this framework does apply to everyone, the way you implement it obviously has to be personalized based on your unique goals, values, and needs. And that's truly where coaching can help. The purpose of coaching isn't just to give you information. It's to help you apply it in a way that actually works for you. It also provides structure, support, and accountability, especially when it comes from someone who's actually been through what you're going through and has achieved the results you want, which is something you simply can't create on your own. So if you are interested in working with me personally, or simply have any questions about coaching, feel free to check out my website, shoot me an email, or reach out to me on Instagram. But just to be very clear, I definitely didn't make this video to pitch coaching. And I hope that's obvious. I made this video because I believe this information should be accessible. This was the information I wish I had when I was struggling with my own journey, and I want others who are struggling to have it too. With that being said, I really hope this video was helpful and gave you some of the answers you were looking for. Please make sure to give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to my channel so you never miss any of my future videos. See you guys soon!